Good morning, everyone. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes to let everyone join for the webinar. So good morning, everyone. I'm going to speak slightly slowly while everyone does the tradition of joining into the webinar. My name's Hugh Ellis, and I'm Head of Policy at the Town and Country Planning Association, and a very warm welcome to this launch of the TCPA and RTPI Planning for Climate Change Guide, which is a new edition. Just to give you a quick run through of the agenda, and also to thank, before we start, both the RTPI and particularly Flood Re who've supported this process. It's quite a focused session for about an hour. I just make that commitment to you that we'll be finished precisely on time at 10:30. There's going to be a quick few words from me, then Joanne Aveley, Chief Planner from Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities. Then we're going to take you through a very quick summary of the changes that have been made to the guidance since the last edition, because quite a lot has happened in relation to climate change since then. Then we're going to look at some practicalities from Rob Lacey from Cornwall, who are one of the outstanding authorities, I think, making progress with climate change. Then we're going to hear from Richard Bly about the RTPI's broad breadth of work around climate change. And then some closing remarks from Anne Chatinet, who's Transition Policy Manager and Impact Manager at Flood Re. And in my opening comments about that, I would say only that there are two physical tsunamis. You may have heard me talk depressingly about climate change before. If people and communities haven't got the impact and the science of the physical impacts of climate change, then we're not doing our job properly. Those impacts are severe, they're growing, and they are pretty unavoidable to some extent. So the need for radical cuts in emissions will always be our priority, but we now know there's an enormous adaptation challenge to deliver. But what's interesting is that those arguments are not persuading many people, are they? Let's be frank. What is persuading people is what underlies this session, which is the economics of climate change. And I would say only there that it's been fascinating to work with Flood Re and with lenders to understand that lenders are no longer lending mortgages in flood risk areas, and insurers are thinking very, very hard about the future shape of their industry as a result of the risks generated. So it'll be the financial tsunami that will finish communities first. It will be lending or not, and therefore essentially small-scale collapses in property markets as a result of climate impacts, and it will be the cost of insurance, ever-increasing costs, which we've seen in other parts of the world, hitting us hard. So we all know that, don't we? And so therefore the question is, what are we going to do about it? The heart of that is building resilience, staggeringly quick cuts in emissions, and the complete re-engineering of our places based on resilience. And the reason that that is so important for this agenda is because a great deal of that falls on planning. Planning is a extraordinarily important way of cutting emissions and adapting to climate change. Why? Because we make so many decisions, we make such complex decisions, and they all impact on people and the built environment. I still think planning is the most important discipline in the world because of that. It's about people and place, and that is complicated and vitally important. So the way that this guide is designed to operate is to provide some guidance for planners on the ground, practical guidance, and Celia will talk a little bit more about the detail of that, but it contains both guidance and now, interestingly, an online case study resource. And I would say to practitioners, again, the reason the guide is there is because it can feel overwhelming as an issue, but I also think the number of resources out there can feel overwhelming as well. So there is a lot out there from technical resources on particular adaptation issues. And so this is designed, this guide, as always, to be a kind of a route map, not to do all of the detail, to provide the confidence that you should have in working on this agenda. And just before I move on to Joanna, I think I would say that do bear in mind that there is only one direction of travel. I know there's a lot of change going on with planning. We're going through a big transition at the moment, but this agenda is not going away. It will be the dominant part of your professional practice for the next 30 years. And we therefore need to have very powerful responses to it. This is not an issue that will disappear. Some of us who are old enough to remember Agenda 21 have seen rounds of so-called environmental enthusiasm. This is not that at all. It's absolutely fundamental. And the reason for that is because the impacts are going to go on hitting us and hitting us increasingly hard. So it's important that we get ahead of it. My top tip for today is you have to embed adaptation and mitigation from the very beginning and at the very heart of all you do. Bear in mind, you've got a legal obligation in planning law to do that. That's what that Section 19 duty says. And that Section 19 duty is transposed in the Levelling Up Bill. So there's no weakening of that in planning. It is the most powerful outcome duty in the whole of the planning process. It must have policy on mitigation and adaptation in your plans. And the resources to support that hopefully are focused on this agenda. So I'm going to quickly move on because we are short of time to Joanna Averley, who's really kindly going to spend some time just talking about the government priorities on climate change. Joanna, welcome to the session.
Thanks, Hugh. And first of all, can I just say a word of thanks to TCPA and the RTPI and all that be involved in the guide. It's just really important that, as you say, Hugh, the challenges that we're facing are very real. Like you know, I'm long in the tooth, and I first studied planning in 1988 when I started my undergraduate degree, and pretty much at the dawning of Brundtland and even the definition of sustainable development, you know, that we plan and we change our environments in light of future generations, but also the impact we have today on our futures. And I suppose just to really just embellish what you've just said and underpin it, you know, those things are no longer in the future. They're with us now, and the impacts are being felt now. And so we're at a point of reality in terms of thinking about climate change, which is with us, and how we cope with that, and obviously reduce any further sort of impacts that might be having. So thanks very much for putting the guide together and refreshing it. It's really important that people do see it as the heart of the planning system. And just to that point, I'm just going to give you a little bit of context, some of which you will already know about and some of which is a little bit more recent and you may or may not have picked up, but it just sort of shows the energy and the drive behind the different aspects of planning, placemaking, infrastructure, and how we are adapting, government are adapting and changing how we are doing various things in the system of our built and our natural environment that all sort of speak to sustainable development, climate change, climate adaptation, and so on. And it is always worth reminding ourselves about sustainable development being the kind of core purpose of the planning system. And even in the updates of the NPPF we did now over 18 months ago, intentionally, you know, the sustainable development goals are mentioned as being part of our kind of considerations in the planning system. And I think everyone will be very aware of the changes that are being considered through the Levelling Up Regeneration Bill. And two things I think are really important to note. One is this is definitely about a plan-led system. And if anything, it's strengthening the fact that we've got a plan-led system. And as Hugh was sort of alluding to, what we're talking about is how you use a plan-led system, a strategy for your place to deal with economic change, social change, desires to consider health and well-being more readily, desires to pursue active travel, and the challenges of climate adaptation, and then energy use, and so on and so forth. So the whole point is the plan is the way that that comes together in terms of the physical reality of our places, and obviously the unique context of each place that we plan for. And I think that should give us confidence that, you know, planning is at the heart of some of this thinking, but also should be at the heart of thinking through some of the solutions and actually understanding the complexity of issues that we're sort of trying to grapple with. So I'm just going to sort of talk about some context of some things that are happening and are sort of quite live at the moment. So first of all, just in case you haven't picked it up, huge amounts of work was launched on 31st of January around environment and environmental enhancement, and one of the sort of pillars really of sustainable development, which is actually how we improve the biodiversity of the country and literally the ecology of our environments and all that offers. And two things happened on the 31st of Jan. One was the publication of the Environmental Improvement Plan, which is a 5-year plan from government, which is very fulsome in its considerations across different aspects of the environment, covering a number of goals, everything from thriving plants and wildlife, clean air, clean and plentiful water, managing exposure to chemicals and pesticides, managing our resources, minimizing our waste, etc. And so that's just a very important set of objectives from government, which touch many different aspects that talk to the planning system. On the same day, there was the launch of the Green Infrastructure Framework by Natural England, which again I commend to you because it's just a really good range of material, which is about, again, dealing with environment, blue and green infrastructure, and how that sort of feeds through into many bits of local government thinking, but also into very particularly into planning. And the reason why I'm sort of commending that to you is because it very much dovetails the work that Natural England have done, has very intentionally dovetailed with things that are in the planning system already, particularly, for example, National Model Design Code. And so there are basically green infrastructure principles to look at, green infrastructure standards, non-mandatory, all of this is advisory. Then, as I said, a green infrastructure planning and design guide, which talks to the National Model Design Code. And then what are referred to as process journeys. So even starting to help think through, well, how do you even start to think about these issues? What's the process that you should sort of go through? And very excitingly, as you will know, Natural England had already launched their green infrastructure map, so the data set, and they've done an update to that. And I just want to give a mention to that and the power of digital data in helping us think through these issues. And he's mentioned already sort of flood mapping and so on. We're doing a lot of work, as you know, in the department around modernisation of the planning system and the use of digital data, digital software for, say, community engagement, but also how we digitise ultimately the plans themselves. And that's about not just the planning system being more efficient and more accessible, but actually that the inputs of digital inputs can help us deal with this layering of issues. If you think flood, environment, resilience, the built form, transport, accessibility, all these sort of different aspects. So it's quite exciting times. It's all evolving and moving forward, but I think that's one of the key sort of tools that's going to be helping us in the future sort of think through these problems. So huge amounts going on in terms of the environment. And then obviously to Hugh's point, you know, we have to figure out about resilience and adaptation. And I think in that regard, the key change, which I'm sure everybody on this call is aware of, is the changes we did with the National Design Guide and the National Model Design Code, which, as you will know, is relevant in the planning system now, both through a desire that local authorities prepare their own codes, and we're supporting a number of local authorities in that regard, but also that it's material and planning applications now. And nature, again, is at the heart of that, resource use and movement. So again, the contemporary way that we should look at all these sorts of different issues as we look at both setting standards, defining what's important within local policy, and bearing in mind design codes will become mandatory once the bill is enacted. There'll be a point in time where local authorities are expected to prepare a design code for their local area, but also then in decision making, the National Model Design Code is relevant now as you determine planning applications, and so it can bite now in terms of looking at those considerations. So, and within that, you know, within nature, it's everything from tree planting to help with sort of heat effects and shading, orientation of buildings, obviously flood management and sustainable urban drainage and other systems. So it's a very sort of, again, this sort of people are feeding back to us. It's a really good menu that people are finding really useful, both to have a conversation with communities, but also to be able to test whether it's development or the policies in your plan, whatever it is you might be doing. The next round of work, which I'm just going to touch on fairly briefly because I'm almost at time, is that if you take it that we've got the environment, the green and the blue infrastructure, the very essence of, you know, life in a sense, that we are trying to improve. We have how we deal with our urban environments currently and how we make them more resilient, and so on. There's then three elements which are broadly around net zero: energy production, energy distribution, and energy use. And it's worth note just a few words on each of those. Energy production, obviously within the NPPF prospectus, we've asked for feedback on what people want to see as a way of testing local support for onshore wind, to sort of see that coming through the system more. We're doing huge amounts of work in the National Strategic Infrastructure Planning regime, which is about bringing forward more renewable energy into the system. And nationally, this is going to be really important for all of us. It's not just about energy security, it's about decarbonising our energy sources. And that's onshore, offshore wind, and an expectation that we'll be delivering those projects through the planning system 50% faster than we do now, because, as Hugh was saying, time is of the essence. I should always just mention to colleagues, we can get the energy produced, we then have to distribute it. Colleagues should always be aware of that as part of that wider infrastructure requirement. And then actually the obvious thing then is energy in use, and the really important work on future home standards as it migrates and becomes more demanding as a standard for new build properties and the future building standard. So actually how buildings become more efficient over time, and recognizing also that we also need to tackle not just new build, but obviously the existing stock is incredibly important and is a major source of energy take. And finally, just to go back to movement, just a little update which colleagues may well have picked up on, but Active Travel England, we've now laid the statutory instrument to make them a statutory consultee. So new kid on the block as an organisation of government, very much pursuing how we see active travel, the ability to walk and cycle, that being a preference for people because of the layout of our urban environments, both in terms of new provision for cycling and walking in existing environments, but also that provision within new places. And so that's another sort of strand to this sort of wider context for promoting sustainable development and places that work well for the environment and for climate. Hugh, back to you.
Joanna, thank you so much for that. I should have said at the beginning, and my apologies, that we don't really have any time in this very quick session for Q&A, but there are some Q&A questions building up, and it wouldn't be any fun if I was chairing this session if I wasn't controversial at all during the presentations. So I'll say just two things which Joanna, I don't expect you to comment on, just to give you a relief. I think that the first is, colleagues, please respond to what the NPPF consultation says on carbon forecasting. It's really, really important. We really support that measure. It's absolutely critical that local plans have a robust carbon forecasting literate system that underpins a plan. It's the transformational measure, and the guide talks a little bit about how you can do that. And the reason for that is that, you know, when you make decisions, you have to have an evidence base for them. And if the inspectorate comes along and strikes down energy efficiency standards in buildings, you turn around to them and say, well, first of all, guys, you've got a legal duty to hit the targets. And secondly, if you strike that down, how else do we get there? And that's a very important agenda. And then finally, and totally controversially, no, the planning inspector are wrong at West Oxfordshire, guys. In the guide, we make clear why they're wrong. You have those powers, you should use them. But use your elbow room, be creative, be robust, push really, really hard, because this is a really important agenda. Anyway, I can say that, and I'm going to move swiftly on before too much comment comes in to talk about the updates to the guide. Celia Davis has worked tremendously hard on this from our point of view. It's just going to run quickly through the key points to that. If people want to go on adding stuff into the Q&A, that's great, because we can accumulate those questions, and they are really important to us actually in terms of trying to get some responses and a sense of what you need out there as a planning community. So Celia, thank you.
Yeah, thanks Hugh. Good morning everyone. My name's Celia and I'm a Projects Policy Manager at the Town and Country Planning Association, and I've been leading some of our work on planning for climate change, including the most recent update to the climate change guidance. So I just intend to spend a few minutes giving a really quick overview of some of the parts of the guide that have been updated, and also just point you to where you can find those resources. So if we move on to the next slide, please. The guide was first produced by the TCPA with the Royal Town Planning Institute in 2018, and we're now on the 4th edition of the guide, which I think reflects the pace at which the policy context is changing and that best practice is changing, but also how much we value this guidance and think it's really important to have an up-to-date version of that available to planning practitioners. The guide is pitched at an introductory level for planners at all levels, and the reason is because we want to cover a broad range of issues and levers that can be used to address climate change through the planning system, and that covers both policy and decision making. So in terms of this edition, what's new? Well, there are some sections where we've updated the content a bit more comprehensively. One of those is in relation to net zero buildings and energy efficiency and planning policy. There's been lots of change in this, and we hope we've kind of captured the kind of current context. And I know that Rob will speak a bit more about this when he talks about Cornwall's experience with their climate emergency development plan documents. So the content there should be, as it stands, up to date. We have, throughout the guide, increased the emphasis on sustainable transport, and particularly in relation to how transport considerations can influence locations and the spatial strategy of local plans and the design of development. We've also updated throughout the document references to policy, guidance and evidence, and in some parts of it, particularly around Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, where there has been national policy and legislative changes, and emphasis on the implications of the planning practice guidance on flood risk and coastal change. And as Joanna mentioned, some of those national changes around the National Model Design Code and Act to Travel England are referenced in the guidance now. So another key instigation for the update was to improve the accessibility of the document. So the document is now compatible with assistive technology, and the accessibility throughout the document is improved. The next point on the next slide, please, Sally, is just to talk about the layout and formats of how we've presented the guidance. One of the key changes is that we've moved the case study content of the guidance to an online platform. We're hoping this really will give the guide a bit more longevity, just to reflect that some of that best practice is changing quite quickly. And because we're using planning policy case studies quite often, the status of those changes quite rapidly. So by having the case studies online, we're hoping we can keep that resource really up to date and relevant and reflect best practice as it's changing, and also some of those current national changes that are being implemented at the moment. So throughout the guidance document, there are links to the case study guide, which will take you straight to that web page. And there's two resources really that sit next to each other and complement each other, is the intention. So just to be clear that this guide reflects the current national planning policy framework. We're aware of the planning reform agenda and acknowledge that in due course, as the Levelling Up Bill makes its way through Parliament, we may need to do more significant revisions. But as it stands, we hope it's a fairly kind of current version of the truth, if you like. And my final slide really was just to thank the supporters and contributors to the guide. As Hugh mentioned, this was made possible through support from Floodry that we really value, and through partnership with Royal Town Planning Institute. But there's been other contributors that we'd really like to thank, including the Environment Agency, independent consultants, all of the organisations you see listed on this slide. So a great thanks to everybody who's shared their expertise and their practice and helped keep this up to date. I did just want to give one final plug, if I may. I think I've got a bit of time. The Town and Country Planning Association are currently working with the Centre for Sustainable Energy on a project for the Committee on Climate Change. We're doing a research project to look at the scope of the planning system and the outcomes in relation to climate resilience and climate change mitigation. We anticipate that we'll be launching a survey for planning practitioners, not just in the public sector, but across the private sector as well. And just wanted to give that a bit of plug to look out for that, and I'd really encourage you to take part. And another thing is just to say that this is the most recent edition of the guidance. We know that the context is changing a lot, and we really welcome feedback of areas that it should cover for the next time. And also, if you have any case studies or best practice that you would like to share and have covered on our case study hub, we'd really welcome hearing from you. That's what I was going to say, and I'll pass back to you, Hugh. Thank you.
Celia, thanks so much for that, and again to all our supporters. And of course, if you want to, be a part of it, the ongoing process of updating and support the process, do get in touch with us. And I know you must all be heartily sick of surveys coming round. This one, I would say this, wouldn't I? This is really important, I think, because the Committee for Climate Change needs to understand the fine grain of what it's like out there on the ground and just how tough it is on resources, I think, and skills and capacity in local government at the moment. So please, if you do find time to respond to it, we will be very grateful. Moving swiftly on, we're going to go from the guide to talk to people who are delivering it on the ground. And it's fantastic to welcome Rob Lacey from Cornwall. Rob, you've been pioneering in Cornwall some fantastic activity around climate change for a good few years. And you're going to tell us about your response to the climate emergency. So, Rob.
Right. Thank you, Hugh. Good morning. So if I could have the first slide, please. So just to give a bit of backstory, I suppose, for Cornwall, we declared a climate emergency in 2019. And as part of that, an action plan was agreed that included making new planning policies for Cornwall, which instantly introduced a bit of a headache for the team in working out how we would then pursue that. And what we came up with is a series of policies that prioritise tackling climate change and support the UK commitment to achieve net zero carbon by 2050. But I think we have to recognise, while we were doing that, whilst some changes have been made nationally, and those include changes to building regs and the plan for the future home standard, the new EV charging requirements, and that earlier target for 2035 for decarbonisation of energy, that national approaches tend by their nature to be quite slow and incremental, and that planning advice remains lagging, in our opinion, in advance of the new planning system. And we know that the last update to government guidance for energy efficiency measures was 2019. And I'll say a little bit about that in a moment in terms of the context of our inspector's report. We know that once the government's new planning system is live, that we can progress a new local plan that will reflect that latest position and make the next set of choices about location and development, which we couldn't deal with in the DPD. But it's been critical that we act now to avoid future delays. And that's particularly important now, I think, that a new local plan can't be put in place until at least 2027. So it's very much, I think, in Cornwall, seen as a journey from getting our house in order now and looking forward to the next local plan. If I could have the next slide, please. So in terms of the policy development and action, development of the approach required quite careful thought about how we apply policies to our existing spatial strategy. So we developed this as a DPD, and that's quite important in terms of allowing our existing housing need to be met and to make changes that are directly relevant to our challenges. And that took a good deal of thinking about in how we promote a series of actions that then updated essentially our local plan to deal with the challenges of climate change. And our local plan was put in place in 2016, but much of our examination was 2015, which is a bit of a strange time in terms of climate change and particularly around renewables. So we lost our ability at that point to be granting planning permission for wind turbines. So we've been stuck with that for a number of years. We needed to look at the necessary and achievable changes that could be made and assess what could and should be delivered through other teams and projects, what might be saved until a better mechanism is put in place. So lots of choices there. And one example, I suppose, is around embodied carbon measurements. We're really keen to incorporate that in the plan, but they're really currently very complex to deliver through planning. So that's one of the things that we are looking to do in a future iteration of the plan. But some of the things that we did tackle are things that we can look at now. So things like the way that we travel, energy and fuel poverty, which is still quite high in Cornwall, and also looking at things like changing patterns of work. So just after we started this, then we moved into the pandemic, and that introduced more change. So lots of things have changed on this, reflecting, I suppose, that point about it being a bit of a journey for us. And it's important, of course, in any plan to select the most appropriate ways forward under the current legislation and using the tools that we have now. So we're minimising operational carbon, but those future approaches will seek to minimise operational and embedded carbon when the tools are available and simple to use. Our approach has also had to allow for new technologies and simplify tools to help embed changes and to allow our policies to flex. And of course, we've looked at the viability, deliverability and practicability, if I can say it, of the proposals. And additional guidance has been produced and changes have been made to our design guide to enable future design codes to deliver layout changes that provide additional detail on how to achieve the layouts that help us to get the policy through. If I could have the next slide, please. And this slide just shows really, I suppose, the number of points that we were taking into account. So we worked from early on with our communities and with key stakeholders to develop a soft scope of the document and identify a number of areas that policies could help to support the current local plan. And those main challenges were initially, I think, when we first started, around renewables and having the mapping to allow wind turbines to be delivered, but we expanded that gradually to help deliver wider changes that would be identified as priorities by our communities, by our key stakeholders. So we worked spent quite a lot of time, for instance, with people like the Environment Agency talking about our approach to coastal change. And also we looked at how we could embed other change through existing tools like our design guide. If I could have the next slide, please. So the main policy areas of the DPD have been developed to further support and expand our local plan and the climate change action plan approach. So it includes things like broad areas identified for turbines, so base, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Policies to set out what we mean by certain things like good quality green infrastructure provision and how that incorporates biodiversity net gains. We have a 10% requirement that's been in place in Cornwall since March 2020 for major applications. And then we have other policies around tree retention and planting, having a minimum requirement for canopy on site. Those then take our local plan much further than there was. So in 2015, for instance, green infrastructure, it was probably enough to have a policy that promoted green infrastructure. Now we recognise the need for much greater standards around that. And as Joanna identified earlier, then we've got the national standards as well, which are helping us to develop our design guidance further. We also have supported policy for agriculture and rural businesses, diversifying and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and dirty water. Alternative living, and I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. And then the approach to reducing energy and carbon in new homes using an energy metric. And finally, I suppose, identifying and enabling communities at risk of coastal change and flooding, and to provide actions to help them to plan for that, which is particularly important for a large coastal authority. Next slide, please. So I've been asked to say a little bit about 2 or 3 of our policies that have drawn attention. SEC1, sustainable building construction, so one of the first of its kind. It's something that that Bath and North East Somerset have also got an approach to now. And this was very much about helping to keep Cornwall on track for net carbon zero, neutral, sorry, by 2050, meaning that our housing and commercial buildings need to change as soon as possible. And it also addresses high levels of fuel poverty. So we're really keen to make sure that this policy really impacts the lives of our residents. When we started, it was around somewhere around 11 to 13% of Cornish households in fuel poverty. I think that's predicted to be around 2/3 nationally by January last year. So fuel poverty is growing, and I have to confess I have moments of anxiety when I look at my smart meter as well. So it's really important to our residents, and that policy uses the REBA, LETI, best practice, cost modelling and consultation feedback to inform it. And it improves on the future home standards and the building regulations changes for 22 and 25, and seeks to lower energy use and thereby fuel bills for our residents by introducing better air tightness, integrated renewables, and helping to regulate unregulated energy. So it's designed to be simpler to design to and to monitor due to the use of an energy metric rather than carbon calculations, which also allows for these easier modelling and monitoring, sorry. And it's also coming in sooner than building regs and the future home standards. So that means that the thousands of houses that we are building in Cornwall at the moment will start to benefit from that approach. Where there are viability constraints, the priority would be moving to space heating, then total energy consumption, and then finally a contribution to offsetting fund that we're providing to help retrofit hard to treat council properties. But it is, I think, a stepping stone to net zero. It's about half the change that's been recommended nationally. And it allows offsetting house by house as a practical step. We have the solar as a preference to be provided on each property. So it requires a balance to be met on each of those properties using a tried and tested reliable technology. But we haven't locked that down totally to allow for changing tech as we go on. And in terms of evidence, we worked with the Southwest Energy Hub, modelling our house types across Cornwall, or typical house types across Cornwall, to test the feasibility and the viability at a general level. I suppose the question is whether this will continue to be relevant. It appears that government commitment to retain the right for authorities to set their own standards, and I guess we'll see what national policy says in due course and how fast those changes to future home standards are. But we anticipate that this will wither away as we get to that point. Next slide, please. We've also, of course, had an approach to renewable energy. So that conundrum, I suppose, around allocating or providing sites. We wanted to be as broad as we could be in that, because Cornwall has quite significant opportunity for renewables. So we've gone for a broad area approach. So that sets out as much as we can. It doesn't, of course, cover all opportunities for wind in Cornwall. So we are then supporting neighbourhood plans by sharing the landscape evidence and supporting our neighbourhood plans, of which we have around 120 designated areas. We've also included within this a community share offer. So for at least 5% to be offered to communities on energy schemes of over 5 megawatts, subject to viability, which gives opportunities, a formal opportunity to benefit from the scheme. The next slide, please. And then in terms of alternative living, this was something that came up fairly early. It's also something that's happened in Dartmoor. So we've been talking to our colleagues in Dartmoor about how this operates. It takes the One Planet development system that's currently in place in Wales and uses that to secure additional biodiversity and carbon improvements on site. It's very much looking towards maintaining links with communities rather than promoting development in the open countryside, but recognising there is a place for that as part of meeting housing needs in Cornwall and promoting lower carbon development. And it's aimed at achieving a demonstrably low impact lifestyle. So despite concerns, I think, that have been raised about increasing the amount of countryside development, this is actually a really hard hurdle to jump. But it does provide for increased flexibility in meeting our housing requirements in a way that can be low carbon. And the next slide, please. So I was also asked to provide some key messages that might be helpful to others preparing documents. And I recognise we're all in different places, but I think these are, and apologies for the really small text. This was really just because the slides would be circulated afterwards. But the inspector gave us a few things that we thought might be appropriate to share. So first of all was the appropriateness of the DPD for the task. So I think there was a very big question at the beginning about whether we should actually review the whole of the local plan, whether you could do something like this through a DPD. And the inspector essentially said that he felt that whilst there was a criticism there that we should have done this through the local plan, that we weren't changing the spatial distribution, that actually a DPD could be quite ambitious in scope and do something that's relatively substantive as part of the climate emergency, but it allowed us to be a little faster. And we all know that creating a plan is not fast in any way, but it did provide us a precursor to further action when we developed the new local plan, and it felt that was therefore a sound approach. He also looked at the appropriateness of setting timescales in advance of the government stated timescales for net zero. And once again, I think we had some criticism that we were going too fast, that we were trying to do too much too soon, and that it wouldn't be achievable within the timescale. But once again, I think that recognition that it would be perverse to hold back and to not carry that work out for fear of not being able to make those targets in time, but also that Cornwall had that renewable energy potential funding for Cornwall from G7, and of course that there's an urgent need to address climate change. So going ahead of the curve is entirely understandable. Next slide, please. But also, I think there's the point about community support, and then that was raised once again in the earlier talk. I think there is still a point about the written ministerial statement and the contradiction that implies. It's not, to my mind, resolved in the new proposals in the NPPF either. But the inspector did. We've spent a bit of time at examination talking about this, that essentially by following the written ministerial statement as we had in the plan, that it would block wind energy development and couldn't therefore be sound and positively prepared. And so we ended up essentially that the statement in policy just requires that the demonstration of the planning impacts of the proposal are acceptable, rather than that wider community acceptability. And I think we'll see how that goes in terms of being able to demonstrate. But certainly we are working quite hard with communities where they have an ambition to bring forward renewables, to ensure that community support is built in from a very early stage. And then I suppose the key one about written ministerial statement, the support for the local energy efficiency measures. Once again, I think this is something that's been recognised by in the new planning proposals, but it did state that actually he felt that the written ministerial statement had been overtaken by events, and that it no longer reflected the urgency and the state of climate emergency. And on that basis, we were allowed to take that energy efficiency policy further and faster. And then just my final slide. Sorry, Hugh. I know we're running out of time. So, any messages that can be concluded? I think there's an acceptance that it's appropriate to have a standalone document, and it can be done with care. It's an interesting test for how perhaps the new supplementary plans proposals will shape up to help create greater ease to address changes. But it isn't a quick thing to do. But we did feel it was the right thing to do at this point. Developing alongside an adopted local plan creates tensions and challenges inevitably, but also shows that it isn't necessary to change everything, that there are urgent responses sometimes and the opportunity to inform our next local plan. And it was very much for us a way of tackling very important issues away from the debate on housing numbers that accompany a local plan preparation. Partnership working has been really important. We work with key stakeholders, and our communities are one of those, of course, to build support from the very start. So that's soft scoping, a lot of work that went into soft scoping, and then 3 formal engagements as went on, as well as thematic workshops for things like wind energy, coastal change management, and really that point about flexibility and viability, that policy can depart some distance from national guidance, but it's important to ensure it's fully justified in evidence, and importantly to retain flexibility to viability in changing technologies. And with that, I shall finish. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob, so much for that. Absolutely brilliant to hear that positive story. Not an easy one, I know, in terms of the way you've managed that process, but I think just a brilliant example of what can be achieved. I'm very short of time, so I'm going to move quickly on now to introduce Richard Bly, Head of Policy and Practice at the RTPI, who've been our partners on this document. Richard.
Yeah, can I change my plan? Scrap the slides, so go back and put that other one up, and I will just talk, I think, generally, because previous speakers, particularly Joanna and Rob, have prompted me to probably respond a little. First thing I'd say is that it needs to be very clear that this document, that the updated guide, refers to the 4 countries of the UK. And in particular, in Scotland and Wales, I would say that government has made more progress in dealing with the climate challenge than the government in England has. I won't go into the big details of that, but do bear in mind that we worked hard with the TCPA to make this a cross-UK guide, and inside it you will find reference to up-to-date policy from the 4 nations about how all of our local planning authorities can respond to this crisis. In the RTPI, otherwise, we have published in 2021 how planning can deliver transport decarbonisation, and believe me, it's not particularly anything to do with electric vehicles. The main challenge, I think, will be to reduce the number of trips, which is why it's very important to think about the location of housing permissions, and something that we do every 2 years is to analyse that. The results are not massively impressive, still a very large preponderance of large greenfield sites being allocated for housing up and down the country. And that does promote very difficult challenges in terms of transport. We've heard a lot about buildings today, but transport is the other area which has shown absolutely no improvement in its emissions for 30 years, despite the fact that as early as 1990, the government was pointing out the need to plan sustainably. On buildings, the RTPI signed up to the Part Z campaign being led by the Institute of Structural Engineers. This will, first of all, require through building regulations, in other words, require through law, reporting on the level of embodied carbon in construction. And following the cues from neighbouring countries in Europe, it will also then gradually ratchet up the if you like, the price you pay for embodying carbon, which is very exciting, and it's very much a long-term plan. The country that's furthest ahead with this is the Netherlands, but others are following fast. And it does have some quite serious implications for planning policy, because we've all heard about the notorious Marks and Spencer store in Oxford Street, London. If it becomes more difficult to meet embodied carbon policy requirements on brownfield development, the implications could well be that there's a greater pressure to develop on green fields where you're not faced with the issues of demolition and replacement. So while this is being, quite rightly regarded as a building regulations issue, the implications for planning policy, and particularly how we redevelop brownfield sites, are very considerable. And the government has put a lot of emphasis on brownfield sites. Just thinking of some around me, most of them require substantial demolition. And under an embodied carbon accounting process, you would look both at, as Rob was saying, operational carbon in use, but also, what price in carbon are you paying for demolishing a building that exists and building an entirely new one in terms of your steel and your concrete. Even your transport emissions required to transport materials to site and remove materials. So that's very important. We all are, as I speak, frantically trying to meet the government's deadline for the response to the NPPF, and also continuing our engagement with the UK Parliament on the Levelling Up Bill. Early on, after the publication of the bill, we did express concern about the concept of national development management policies. And actually, what Rob has been saying this morning does give me even greater concern. Local authorities up and down the country have been pioneering approaches to planning for climate change and resilience. I'm very worried that if the government's proposals for the supremacy of national development policies in law over all other policy are carried through, and at the moment it looks like the position of the House of Commons is completely unyielding on that what Cornwall is doing would be illegal. He wouldn't be able to run ahead of government policy. It would depend on Whitehall keeping up with everybody else on innovation. Going right back to the Merton rule, all of the innovation in planning policy in local authority in England has been with local authorities. It will be imperative that the government keeps up on this, otherwise we'll be going at the pace of the slowest. That's very worrying. Also, the government's proposals to abolish supplementary planning documents. If you look at the quite complicated transitional arrangements proposed, there'll be a point at which all of your supplementary planning documents are again illegal. This is very serious in terms of how, particularly maybe authorities that are less well resourced and large than Cornwall, how on earth are people going to replace their SPDs, some of which, on issues like shop fronts have been quite rightly in place unchanged for a long period of time. So that is quite concerning. On the issue of design codes, the RTPI and the RSPB published last spring Cracking the Code document, which showed how you could extend the principle of codes further than the appearance of buildings into their function, and particularly the appearance and function of places. So that, I think, is still very much worth a read if you want some ideas about how to do a design code that goes beyond appearance. And then we've been hearing about the Environment Act, which is something that I have been nerdily following with great close attention so that you don't need to. And the local nature recovery strategy issue is a big challenge. The government is saying that local plans will be required to follow local nature recovery strategies. There's no reference to the requirement for local nature recovery strategies to follow local plans. So I'm quite concerned about, how this is going to be made to work, and also how many people in local authorities, again, perhaps less fortunate than Cornwall, are going to be able, how many planners are going to be able to take any notice of local nature recovery strategies at all when they're doing all these other things like redoing their whole local plan and all their SPDs. So watch out next Thursday, the 2nd, the RTPI response on the NPPF consultation document will be out, and we'll be stressing, I think it's fairly likely that in particular the NPPF urgently needs to consider climate change. The way the document is written implies that this will all be going to follow later in the year, and probably therefore a quite short notice, which is another concern. We need more than 8 weeks to look at what the government is proposing in terms of climate policy in the NPPF after the next one. Thank you.
Richard, thank you so much for that. And I think we share many of your anxieties about national development management policies, and also I think your enthusiasm for where innovation comes from, which has been on climate change, always bottom up, interestingly enough. Just in the last few minutes, can I welcome Anne Chattignay, who's Transition Policy Impact Manager at Floodry. Anne, you've made all this happen. So I'm so sorry that you only have a couple of minutes to speak, but I guess it bookends us in terms of the importance of insurance and lending, doesn't it?
Thank you so much, Hugh. So my name is Anne Chattignay. I'm Transition Policy and Impact Manager at Floodry. So I'll tell you a bit more about what Floodry does. So Floodry is a government and insurance industry partnership. We exist to enable affordability and availability of home insurance for houses at high risk of flooding across the UK. So we welcome that the Climate Guys covers the entire UK. Now, we have eligibility criteria in our reinsurance scheme, whereby we only cover homes built until 2009. The other thing to note as well is that we exit the market in 2039. So we were created to palliate a market failure. And in the meantime, until we exit, we seek to act as a catalyst for change and reducing flood risk in the UK, reducing the damage and cost of flooding to a home, and improving the insurance market condition to have a risk-reflective pricing. So you mentioned lenders and insurers at the beginning, Hugh, and the financial cost of flooding. So the Bank of England has asked in their stress test, climate change stress test, to for lenders and insurers to assess the risk of climate change to their portfolio. Under the no additional action scenario, the most costly growing peril is flooding and surface water flooding. So that looks at a 30-year scenario. But that's a no additional action. So that means there can be solutions put in place. And because we only cover homes until 2009, we are very interested in not making sure that there's no cliff edge when we leave, and that we can reduce the risk posed to new developments and where they are decided to be built on. So why we're doing this is because insurers and lenders want better, if not reduced risk. And that's the financial cost, but there's also an economic and an environmental and health cost to homeowners. So we're also doing this to safeguard homeowners from additional protection costs as well. Now, the solutions exist through planning policy. They also exist in, so it's a mix of mitigation and early adaptation. And we've come up with solutions through the insurance industry, like Build Back Better scheme, and incentivizing those solutions for property flood resilient measures early on through looking at a flood performance certificate. And how does that link with the energy performance certificate that also needs a review? So including our engagement on policy also includes looking at the investment level of flood defenses and how that can be complemented with natural flood management. Now, the good thing about flooding is that it highlights systems failures, and it also highlights policy uncertainty. So how can we create more synergies? When we talk about net zero, there is a carbon cost to flooding, and I really appreciate your point, Richard, about demolition and reconstruction, because Aviva has just recently done some work, and it's estimated that 6.5 transatlantic flight would be the actual emissions of an average reconstruction after a flood. So overall, what we'd like to see is not just improved consideration for current but future risk of flooding, but more clarity, first of all. So, for example, we don't have enough information on subsurface. How do we make sure that the planning system works not only on the surface, but on the subsurface? And lastly, capacity and controls are important. So what we're calling for now is a systems thinking approach of nature and built environment and climate-ready homes. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Amsand. I'm so sorry to have to rush you at the end. It's really important stuff. We've tried to cover a tremendous amount of territory. I want to thank all of our speakers. It started a massive amount of debate I can see online in the Q&A. So just two things to conclude with that. We will, sometimes pursuing clarity can be a mistake, can't it, if you get the wrong answer at the end of it. There is no doubt at all the 2015 written ministerial statement is out of date, not because it's old in years, but because it's predicated on a series of assumptions that underlay that statement that never happened, not least implementation of parts of the Energy Act. So let's be clear about that. That is all written down, part of the guide and also part of the statement. The TCPA worked with some legal advice to produce. I think if it's okay, Joanna, we'll take on the obligation to try and pursue a great deal, obviously, of anxiety and concern that's generated by that uncertainty. I'm only willing to pursue it if we get absolutely the right answer. Now, finally, I would say all of the comments I can see about, oh my God, this is more work, more stress, more difficulty placed upon the planning system at a very difficult time. I know that, we feel it, but we just can't get this wrong. We just can't we cannot afford, time is out on climate change. We have to get this right. And I think that means that if you're at the local level, if you're pioneering at the local government level, please crack on, be determined, be brave, because ultimately you owe your allegiance to the public interest. And you have to push absolutely as hard as you possibly can to secure a reasonably resilient future for future generations. That is your overwhelming obligation. And so failure is not an option. Thank you all. Thank you all for your innovation and your work at the local level, because you're doing a brilliant bloody job, frankly, in solving this crisis. And please keep in touch with us. We will keep the guide updated. We wish you all very well. Thank you very much for coming.